From San Francisco, this is Democracy Now!
Hurricane Florence is fast approaching. It's going to be here over the next 48 hours, and they say it's about as big as they've seen coming to this country, and certainly to the East Coast, as they've ever seen. We'll handle it. We're ready. We're able.
Up to 40 inches of rain are feared in parts of the Carolinas as Hurricane Florence moves closer to land. While the storm is beginning to weaken, fears growing the storm could result in catastrophic waste spills from pig farms and coal ash ponds. We'll go to North Carolina for the latest. Then the Global Climate Action Summit officially opens today here in San Francisco, just days after the event's organizer, California Governor Jerry Brown, signed a bill to shift California to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045.
California is committed to doing whatever is necessary to meet the existential threat of climate change. And yes, it is an existential threat. No matter what the naysayers may say, it is a real, present danger to California and to the people of the world.
While Jerry Brown is often described as a climate hero, climate justice activists are preparing to protest the opening of today's summit. We'll speak with Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org. His latest piece, Jerry Brown's Climate Legacy, is still being decided. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from San Francisco. In North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia, millions of residents are bracing for today's arrival of Hurricane Florence, which meteorologists are warning could unleash life-threatening storm surges and historic flooding across a wide swath of the East Coast. While Florence has now been downgraded to a Category 2 hurricane, experts are still warning its impact could be catastrophic. This is North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper.
This monster of a storm is not one to ride out. When you're looking at a storm surge of this magnitude, where the National Weather Service has says that the damage is going to be unbelievable and that they cannot emphasize it enough, we know that that's a message that we should listen to.
Hurricane Florence is also expected to cause widespread environmental damage, including triggering catastrophic waste spills from sewage treatment plants, hog waste lagoons, and chicken farms that line the Carolina coast. In North Carolina, the billion-dollar pork industry is clustered in the eastern part of the state, directly in the line of the storm. Many of these factory hog farms store their waste by spraying it on nearby fields and neighborhoods or by depositing it in lagoons that can overflow during hurricanes, causing the toxic pig manure to pour into nearby waterways. At least 9 nuclear facilities also lie in the storm's path, including Duke Energy's Brunswick nuclear plant in North Carolina. Brunswick's boiling water reactors are similar to ones that melted down at the Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan in 2011 after a massive tsunami there. Meanwhile, evacuations are underway in the Philippines, where Super Typhoon Mangkhut has reached the strength of a Category 5 hurricane. The storm already caused power outages and flooding on Guam, where the governor has asked President Trump for federal aid. The typhoon is expected to make landfall in the Philippines Saturday before barreling toward China, Vietnam, and Laos. We'll have more on Hurricane Florence after headlines. President Trump is facing widespread backlash after he tried to claim Tuesday his administration's response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico last year was an incredible unsung success in response to questions about what we could learn from Hurricane Maria as Florence approaches the Carolinas coast.
FEMA and law enforcement and everybody did, working along with the governor in Puerto Rico, I think was tremendous. I think that Puerto Rico was an incredible unsung success.
Hurricane Maria killed up to 3,000 people in Puerto Rico, if not more, making it the deadliest storm in U.S. history. This is San Juan Mayor Carmen Yulín Cruz responding to Trump.
The world has seen, and the majority of the American people have seen how neglectful he was towards the people of Puerto Rico. if he calls a success or an unsung success 3,000 people dying on his watch, definitely he doesn't know what success is.
Trump once again attacked San Juan Mayor Carmen Yulín Cruz, tweeting, "We got A+ for our recent hurricane work in Texas and Florida and did an unappreciated great job in Puerto Rico. Even though an inaccessible island with very poor electricity and a totally incompetent mayor of San Juan, we are ready for the big one that's coming," he tweeted. But it wasn't only the mayor who criticized Trump. His own ally, Puerto Rico's governor, Ricardo Rosselló, also attacked Trump, saying, quote, "No relationship between a colony and the federal government can ever be called successful because Puerto Ricans lack certain inalienable rights enjoyed by our fellow Americans in the states," the governor said. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's response to Hurricane Maria faced even more criticism Wednesday after the publication of new photos showing millions of bottles of water meant for hurricane victims still sitting unused on a tarmac nearly a year after the hurricane made landfall. In immigration news, the New York Times reports more migrant children are currently detained than at any other time in recorded U.S. history. The Times says at least 12,800 migrant children are currently imprisoned inside over 100 federally contracted facilities across the United States, a five-fold increase over this time last year. Most of the children arrived in the United States without their parents and are now in the custody of the Health and Human Services Department's Office of Refugee Resettlement, as the Trump administration has resisted releasing them to live with their families or sponsors in the U.S. Meanwhile, in a major victory for migrant families forcibly separated by immigration officials at the border, up to 1,000 of these asylum seekers will receive a new chance to have their claims heard. The settlement comes after asylum seekers filed multiple lawsuits saying they were forced to argue for asylum while traumatized by the fact that their children had just been torn away from them. The New York Times is reporting, excuse me. The New York Times is reporting former Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt is in talks to work as a consultant for the Kentucky coal tycoon Joseph Kraft III. Pruitt was forced to resign from the EPA amidst an onslaught of corruption scandals and widespread opposition to his campaign to roll back key environmental protections, including regulations around coal mining. He's been replaced by an ex-coal lobbyist, Andrew Wheeler. In news on the U.S.-backed war on Yemen, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has certified the governments of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates are taking sufficient steps to protect Yemeni civilians, meaning the U.S. will continue providing crucial mid-air refueling and other military support for Saudi Arabia's war on Yemen. In a memo, Pompeo cited the U.S. training of the Saudi Royal Air Force to justify the decision, which flies in the face of widespread evidence that the coalition is indiscriminately killing Yemeni civilians, including children. In August, a coalition airstrike hit a school bus, killing 51 people, 40 of them children. In response, Oxfam said, quote, "This administration is doubling down on its failed policy of literally fueling the world's largest humanitarian crisis." In Guatemala, the government deployed thousands of police and soldiers to the streets of Guatemala City Wednesday amidst growing mass protests against efforts by Guatemalan President Jimmy Morales to shut down the United Nations-backed Anti-Corruption Commission investigating high-level politicians and elites. President Morales has defied Guatemala's highest constitutional court by barring the head of the commission, Ivan Velázquez Gómez, from entering Guatemala. The commission had been investigating Morales for illegal campaign financing. The commission's investigations also helped oust Morales' predecessor, former President Otto Pérez Molina, in 2015. President Trump's son, Eric Trump, is facing backlash after he used anti-Semitic language while talking about longtime investigative journalist Bob Woodward's explosive new book about the Trump White House. This is Eric Trump speaking on Fox and Friends on Wednesday.
Don't you think people look through the fact that you can write a sensational nonsense book? CNN will definitely have you on there because they love to trash the president. It'll mean you sell 3 extra books, you make 3 extra shekels. I mean, at the behest of the American people, at the behest of our country.
The longtime executive producer of CBS's 60 Minutes, Jeff Fager, has been fired after being accused of sexually harassing women employees, fostering a culture of sexual harassment at 60 Minutes, and bullying one of CBS's own reporters when she reached out to him for comment for a story about the sexual harassment scandals rocking CBS. At least 6 former women employees told The New Yorker Fager had groped or touched them without their consent. He also sent a threatening text message to CBS correspondent Jerrica Duncan, who was reporting on these sexual harassment accusations, texting her, quote, "Be careful. There are people who lost their jobs trying to harm me, and if you pass on these damaging claims without your own reporting to back them up, that will become a serious problem," unquote. Fager's firing comes only days after CBS head Leslie Moonves was ousted after being accused of sexual assault and harassment, and less than a year after CBS's star anchor Charlie Rose was also ousted after being accused of sexual assault and harassment. In Germany, a new report reveals over 3,600 children have been sexually abused by clergy of the Catholic Church, and that at least 1,670 clergy members have been involved in the abuse over the past 7 decades. The report was commissioned by the German Roman Catholic Church Bishops' Conference. It comes in the wake of a larger child sexual abuse scandal rocking the Catholic Church worldwide. On Wednesday, Pope Francis called for a conference at the Vatican in February with international heads of the Church to discuss the crisis. In Russia, Pyotr Vasilov, a member of Russian punk protest band Pussy Riot, has been hospitalized for what is suspected to be a poisoning. Fellow Pussy Riot member Veronika Nikolshina told Russian press that Vasilov lost first his sight, then his ability to speak, then even his ability to walk. In July, Vasilov rushed the field with other members of Pussy Riot during a World Cup match to protest Russian police brutality and was arrested. And in New York, voters are heading to the polls today for a Democratic primary in which several candidates hope to continue the progressive insurgency to unseat powerful Democratic incumbents. Actress-turned-activist Cynthia Nixon is challenging Governor Andrew Cuomo. New York City Councilman Jumaane Williams is taking on Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul. And anti-corruption activist Zephyr Teachout and New York City public advocate Letitia James are among 4 Democrats running to replace Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, who was forced to resign in May after being accused of physically assaulting at least 4 women. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from San Francisco, the site of the Global Climate Action Summit. In North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia, millions of residents are bracing for the arrival of Hurricane Florence, which meteorologists are warning could unleash life-threatening storm surges and historic flooding across a wide swath of the East Coast. This is North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper.
This monster of a storm is not one to ride out. When you're looking at a storm surge of this magnitude, where the National Weather Service has says that the damage is going to be unbelievable and that they cannot emphasize it enough, we know that that's a message that we should listen to.
North Carolina is preparing for the climate change supercharged storm 6 years after passing legislation prohibiting state and local agencies from making planning decisions based on the latest climate science about sea level rise. Now the state is facing the threat of a life-threatening storm surge, which could cause billions of dollars in damages. Even if the storm weakens, experts warn Hurricane Florence could kill thousands of farm animals and trigger catastrophic waste spills from sewage treatment plants, hog waste lagoons, and chicken farms. The state's billion-dollar pork industry is primarily clustered in the eastern part of the state, directly in the line of the storm. Many of the factory hog farms in North Carolina store their waste by spraying it on nearby fields and neighborhoods or by depositing it in lagoons that can overflow during hurricanes, causing the toxic pig manure to pour into nearby waterways. In 1999, Hurricane Floyd dropped nearly 2 feet of rain on North Carolina, flooding the waste lagoons and sending the waste downstream to coastal estuaries, where it boosted nitrogen and phosphorus levels and caused algae blooms and fish kills. Meanwhile, Inside Climate News has published a map showing 24 toxic coal ash containment ponds in the path of Hurricane Florence that may flood in the extreme rainfall. For more, we're going to North Carolina, where we're joined by two guests. Will Hendrick is a staff attorney with the Waterkeeper Alliance and manager of the organization's North Carolina Pure Farms, Pure Waters campaign. And Frank Holloman, senior attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center, where he works on protecting rivers, streams, groundwater, and drinking water sources from coal ash, including after a North Carolina facility owned by Duke Energy spilled 39,000 tons of coal ash into the Dan River in 2014. Well, we welcome you both to Democracy Now! And I wanted to begin with Will. Will, if you could start off by talking about exactly what is happening with all of these animal corporate factory farms and what is being threatened.
Right now, this storm is hurtling towards the epicenter of animal agriculture in North Carolina. And as you mentioned, the vast majority of these factory hog farms utilize what's called a lagoon and spray field system to manage their waste. And in reality, even on the best day, the surrounding communities live under constant threat of an environmental catastrophe. But that threat is significantly exacerbated with the level of rainfall and the height of winds that we are expecting as a result of this storm. And currently, although the industry is feverishly working to remove animals from the coastal plain, the waste is remaining. Many of the operators are furiously drawing down those lagoons by spraying, even in violation of their permit after the National Weather Service has issued warnings prohibiting it. And we know, based on past experience, most recently with Matthew, that as these rainfall events result in flooding, which may take days to manifest, that the facilities are inherently threatened, especially those that are in the 100-year floodplain. And there are still 62 of these factory swine operations storing more than 200 million gallons of animal waste generated each year in the 100-year floodplain. And so the threat is significant, and it won't solely manifest as a result of these initial impacts, but could worsen as floodwaters rise.
I want to turn now to Naima Muhammad, organizing co-director for the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. She appeared on Democracy Now! Last year talking about how hog waste impacts the residents of eastern North Carolina.
The spray is the animal waste that comes out of the hogs are kept in tent metal housing, and they have slacks in the floor where whenever they go to the bathroom or abort baby piglets or whatever happens with them, it falls through the slacks in the floor and it's piped out. There are pipes running underneath the ground, and the waste is piped out into the open air lagoon. And there are all kinds of chemicals. And this urine and fecal matter produces methane, ammonia gases, and so you can smell it. And what people say, it smells like rotten eggs, sometimes rotten collard greens, or it's just a terrible smell. And they have been forced off of their wells because they were seeing remnants of the waste in their well waters by the coloring and the odors coming out of their well water.
Naima Muhammad, North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, is now joining us on the phone. We spoke last year when we were in North Carolina. Naima, welcome to Democracy Now! If you can describe the situation right now and what you're most concerned about. Are you in Greenville right now?
No, I'm not. I'm en route to Greenville.
Mm-hmm. So in the car, tell us about what's happening and your concerns this year, today.
Okay, so our concerns right now with this upcoming hurricane is the number of lagoons and the number of hog houses that are located in the community where people are living and unable to get out of the way of harm. If this storm comes and it's as bad as they are predicting, we learned from Hurricane Florida in 1999 what happens with these animals and these lagoons when we get a lot of rain and get the hurricane. Everything is toppled over and dumped out into the environment and into the rivers and streams and ditches running through the communities. And so you have all this nothing but feces and urine in the waterways and dead animals. If anybody could pull up the pictures from Hurricane Florida, you would see the number of dead animals that wound up in our waterways. And to this day, I don't know, and I have been listening and wondering and looking and trying to hear what did they do with all those animals and how did they clean up our waterways after all that much urine and feces was dumped into it as a result of the storm. So that's a concern that we will experience that again. But the biggest concern is the people that's in harm's way and unable to get out the way. And even in the counties that they're located, there is no real infrastructure in place for moving people in disastrous situations. So the local governments really don't have the whereabouts or the means to assist and accommodate people at this point. And that's a real disaster in itself. And, as I was waiting to talk to y'all this morning, I thought about my friend Rick Dove from the Waterkeeper Alliance, how he has said so many times, they don't have to fix this, but Mother Nature take care of it. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And he was saying that long before Hurricane Florida came. And we saw it then, we saw it at Matthew, and we will probably see it again if this storm does anything near what they said it would do. It doesn't take a whole lot of rain around those lagoons to create problems. And the sad part about having to deal with this stuff is that it doesn't have to be this way. It does not have to be this way. If somebody in this state would have the backbone to make Smithfield put that superior technology on the ground instead of bailing them out by encouraging them to attack the people that's suffering.
Naima Mohammed, you are an environmental leader in North Carolina with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. Has the state gotten in touch with you because you reach out to so many people? Have they prepared appropriately?
No, nobody's reached out to us at any level, not on the state, not on the local, nor the federal level to ask what can they do. Or, here's what we have, and this is how you can use it. We've had none of that take place.
Now, I also think people, when they hear this, this is outside the storm, what you've been dealing with in your communities, particularly communities of color, where you have this waste, fecal matter, sprayed into your communities. Many people will not be able to believe this. Explain how that happens and what you've been subjected to.
Okay, so what happens is you have a lagoon, and I always tell people we're not talking about that blue lagoon that Brooke Shields was hanging out in. We're talking about a lagoon that's nothing but a hole that was dug in the ground, and they are housing all the urine and feces from the hogs that's kept in those houses that they use to grow the animals. And so the waste is sitting out in these open-air lagoons, they have a certain level that they can reach before they stand the possibility of overflowing out of the waste, stands the possibility of overflowing out of the lagoons. And if that happens, that's a violation. And so in order to prevent those violations, when the lagoons begin to fill up, the contract growers then on their operations, they then spray the waste out onto the crops around the areas as fertilizer to prevent the lagoons from overflowing. And the problem with that is that is just nothing but pure feces and urine that they're irrigating into the air, and it's making people sick. You hear people talk about how nauseated they get growing up. The air smells so bad you can barely breathe. You can't go out. You don't want to be outside. If you can go outside, but you don't want to be out there in those conditions. And so it's just it's a real problem. But as I was thinking this morning, I was like, the shame of this all is that the contract grower is in a fix as well, because Smithfield, who's pocketing all of the money from these operations, won't do the right thing by the people in it that live around these animals. They don't do the right thing by the contract growers, and so they're in a fix and a catch-22. Smithfield owns everything: the hogs, the trucks, the feed, everything except the waste. The waste belongs to that grower who is not being paid enough to do anything different from what they're doing. But Smithfield is pocketing billions of dollars in profit every year and can do something about it, but they won't, because it's just like in a capitalist society, your goal is profit over people. You don't care about what happens to anybody else as long as you get your dollar bill. And that's what they're doing, and nobody's making them do anything different to clean up or fix problems.
You're referring to Smithfield Foods. I think it was, it has something like 973,000 square foot meat processing plant in Tar Heel, North Carolina, reported in 2000 to be the world's largest, processing something like 32,000 pigs a day. Just drive carefully, Naima Muhammad, as you make your way to Greenville. We'll be in touch with you again. Thanks so much for being with us, North Carolina Environmental Justice Network leader. We'll continue to talk about what's happening there after this break.
Telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we
It's the world premiere on Democracy Now! Of a new song by Anti-Flag. It's cover of Buffalo Springfield's classic, For What It's Worth. The band made the video with Every Town for Gun Safety. We'll post the full video at democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from San Francisco from the Global Climate Action Summit, but we're continuing to talk about what's happening in North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia. Millions of residents bracing for the arrival of Hurricane Florence, which meteorologists are warning could unleash life-threatening storm surges and historic flooding across a wide swath of East Coast, even if the storm weakens. Experts warn Hurricane Florence could kill thousands of farm animals, trigger catastrophic waste spills from sewage treatment plants, hog waste lagoons, and chicken farms. Meanwhile, Inside Climate News has published a map showing 24 toxic coal ash containment ponds in the path of Hurricane Florence that may flood in the extreme rainfall. We're continuing our discussion in North Carolina, where we're joined in Charlotte by Frank Holloman, who is a senior attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center, where he works on protecting river streams, groundwater, and drinking water sources from coal ash, including after a North Carolina facility owned by Duke Energy spilled 39,000 tons of coal ash into the Dan River in 2014. And still with us, Will Hendricks, staff attorney with the Waterkeeper Alliance, or manager of the organization's North Carolina Pure Farms, Pure Waters campaign. Frank, talk about the coal ash ponds and what you're most concerned about right now. And thanks, as people are preparing in North Carolina, dealing, evacuating, for being in a studio, Frank.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. And we're hoping and praying we don't have a coal ash catastrophe in North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia in the next few days. But here's what we face. The coal ash utilities in the southeast, and in this instance, principally Duke Energy and also Dominion in Virginia, have stored millions of tons of coal ash in unlined pits sitting directly adjacent to our rivers, lakes, and drinking water reservoirs, and they're held back only by dikes made of earth that leak. Now, in the past 10 years, we've had two major coal ash disasters. One at TVA and its Kingston facility in Tennessee, and one by Duke Energy itself on the Dan River in North Carolina near the Virginia line. But those catastrophes happened on a good day when the sun was shining. Each of these sites, we've been warning and is obvious, is a tremendous risk to our communities, particularly when we have a major hurricane, a flood, or a storm. So we're sitting here with more than 20 disasters waiting to happen. We hope none of them do happen, but this is a risk we don't have to tolerate. This ash can be moved to safe dry line storage away from the rivers. And there is one somewhat good news story about this storm, and that is the coastal utilities in South Carolina, instead of lobbying and litigating, have actually been removing ash the last several years so that the risk on the South Carolina coast is much reduced from coal ash. But in North Carolina and Virginia, our coastal residents have to fear the consequences of decades of bad practices and recent years of recalcitrance by Duke Energy and Dominion.
Can you explain where the coal ash comes from, Frank?
Oh, sure. In other words, historically, a lot of the electricity in the Carolinas and Virginia and Georgia has been generated by burning coal. And you need two things to generate electricity from coal. You need coal to burn, and you need water to generate steam. So they've located these coal-fired plants near water bodies, that is, rivers and lakes and drinking water reservoirs. And when they burn the coal, they're left with ash. Now, the ash isn't wet, and it doesn't have to go in a pit. It could simply have been moved uphill and stored dry in a lined landfill, or even recycled into concrete. But instead, to save some money and for their convenience, the utilities dug big pits between their plants and the river simply because water runs downhill. So they'd suck water out of the river, mix it and create a polluted mess with this ash. They call that slurry, and then just flush it downhill into these unlined pits. It's obviously a foolish way to store this stuff. It's obviously risky and dangerous, and it obviously pollutes on a good day. But on a bad day, when we have a serious hurricane, this unnecessary choice puts communities and waterways and clean drinking water at risk.
Frank, can you talk about the law that North Carolina passed 6 years ago prohibiting state and local agencies from making planning decisions based on the latest climate science about sea level rise?
Well, it's just another chapter in the sad story we've seen in America, and that is sometimes people with money at stake seek to deny the truth and prevent our agencies and communities from using good science because of those people's financial self-interest. The science has shown us that sea level rise is accelerating, and there was a proposal to prevent state agencies from considering that evidence at all when they make decisions about what can happen at the coast in light of ongoing sea level rise. Well, that caused a furor, and the legislator involved became the subject of ridicule by Colbert and other comedians across the country. So they backed off, but they still said in making projections out to 30 years, you can't use that information. More than anything, though, it illustrates how politicians who are responding to special interests can restrict and even intimidate state agencies and policymakers from using the best science to make the best decisions for the most people.
Frank, I wanted to bring Bill McKibben into this conversation. As I said, we're here in San Francisco broadcasting through the week for all the events around the Global Climate Action Summit. Bill McKibben is one of those who was in the streets on Saturday. Tens of thousands of people marched in San Francisco, and of course people marched in hundreds of cities all over the world. But this issue of this law in North Carolina, Bill, if you could talk more about it.
So the first thing to be said is everything's connected. How many stories have you done about gerrymandering and voting suppression and things in North Carolina? North Carolina has endured what amounts to a kind of corporate takeover of its politics in recent years, though people are fighting back hard. And one of the manifestations was an almost literally insane law, the kind of King Canute, hold back the rising seas law, that we weren't going to pay attention to the latest climate science. Just imagine passing a law saying, in essence, we cover our eyes and cover our ears.
And so they can't deal with climate science when it comes to sea level rise, and that's precisely with Hurricane Florence what they are terrified of at this moment.
That's right. They can't. It stopped people from, among other things, really thinking as hard as they should be about coastal development. There's been an increase of several orders of magnitude in the number of structures along the North Carolina coast in the last few decades. And I'm afraid we may find out just how flimsy a lot of that is in the next 48 hours. As you know, the category strength of Florence has dropped, but it's an enormous storm now, and it's bringing not only storm surge, probably on a record level, but once that water reaches inland and falls in the mountains, it's going to be coming back down those rivers and streams, which are plugged by the higher sea level. The potential for a flooding catastrophe is like nothing we've almost ever seen.
And I wanted to go back right now to Will Hendrick and ask you about the effects of what we're talking about right now, particularly on communities of color and the most vulnerable populations. I mean, everyone is going to be affected, but talk about why this is a particular concern right now.
Certainly. And sadly, while our leaders have their heads in the sand, many North Carolinians are filling sandbags and preparing for the impact of this storm. And it's one more thing that some among us have to worry about. Every North Carolinian in the coastal plain is making preparations to ensure their family and their property are safe. But unfortunately, some North Carolinians have industrial operations situated right next to them. And that means that while they're worrying about the storm, they're also worrying about the flooding, the runoff, the potential structural failure of the impoundment storing tremendous volumes of animal waste next door to their homes, next door to their property, next door to the castle to which they're retreating in this time of need. And that, sadly, is a plight that is disproportionately felt and experienced by communities of color. They are more likely to live next to one of these industrial hog operations. And that's a point that we have made to our leaders in our environmental division of water resources, and that's the division that permits the continued operation of this outdated lagoon and spray field system. And so along with Naima Muhammad and her group at North Carolina Environmental Justice Network and some of the local environmental justice organizations like the Rural Empowerment Association for Community Health, we pointed out the fundamental problems with discriminating in that fashion and making some among us more required to and more vulnerable to living near these inherently threatening industrial waste sources. Many of them are concerned about what they've seen in the past and what they expect to repeat. Those lagoons overflowing, the dikes that keep the waste collected failing and spewing millions of gallons into their drinking water sources, into their recreational waters. And, you know, the impacts have been seen and experienced countless times now in North Carolina. And as a result of climate change, these storms are growing increasingly frequent and severe. And it's past time for our leaders to demand better waste management. And if, as projected, this storm causes the damage that it might, I hope that our leaders, when asked to rebuild this industry, will rebuild it with better technology so that it stands on better footing and North Carolinians can better live their lives without fear of interference by industrial operations next door.
Will Hendrick, I want to thank you for being with us of the Waterkeeper Alliance, speaking to us from Raleigh, North Carolina. I also want to thank Frank Holloman with Southern Environmental Law Center, speaking to us from Charlotte, North Carolina. I hope you are all safe. Of course, we'll continue to follow this storm that people are talking about as one of the worst possibly that the East Coast has faced in a very long time. I also want to thank Bill McKibben, but he's staying with us, co-founder of 350.org. Stay with us.
Sister of ocean and sand, I welcome you to the land of my ancestors, to the land where they sacrificed their lives to make mine possible, to the land of survivors.
I'm coming to you from the land my ancestors chose. Ailang Kainan, Marshall Islands, a country more sea than land.
I welcome you to Nunaat, Greenland, the biggest island on Earth.
With me, I bring these shells that I picked from the shores of Bikini Atoll and Brunette Dome.
In my hand I hold these rocks, picked from the shores of Nuuk, the foundation of the land I call my home.
With these shells I bring with me a story of long ago. Two sisters frozen in time on the island of Buyay. One magically turned to stone. The other who chose that life to be rooted by her sister's side. To this day, the two sisters can be seen by the edge of the reef, a lesson in permanence.
With these rocks I bring a story told countless times, a story about Sesuma Amna, mother of the sea, who lives in a cave at the bottom of the ocean. This is a story about
Rise
the guardian of the
from
sea.
One Island to Another, poetry by Kathy Jetno-Kajiner of the Marshall Islands and Aka Niviana of Greenland. It's part of a project that our guest, Bill McKibben, was part of. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from San Francisco, where California Governor Jerry Brown's Global Climate Action Summit officially begins today. The conference occurring just days after Brown signed a new law to shift California to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045.
No understating the importance of this measure. SB 100 is sending a message to California and to the world that we're going to meet the Paris Agreement, and we're going to continue down that path to transition our economy to zero emission, zero carbon emission, and to have the resiliency and the sustainability that science tells us we must achieve. California is committed to doing whatever is necessary to meet the existential threat of climate change. And yes, it is an existential threat. No matter what the naysayers may say, it is a real present danger to California and to the people of the world. This bill and others I'm going to sign this week help us go in this direction. But have no illusions. California and the rest of the world have miles to go before we achieve zero carbon emissions.
While Governor Jerry Brown has often been hailed a climate hero, he's also been widely criticized by many climate justice activists who are planning to protest outside the opening of today's summit, for example. During Saturday's Rise for Climate, Jobs and Justice March, I spoke with Doria Robinson, the executive director of Urban Tilth and a member of Our Power Richmond Coalition, criticizing the governor's embrace of cap and trade.
Because of some recent rules, we can't put a cap on how much pollution that is because of what Jerry Brown and everyone in the state government here did. And so that means that people can buy the right to basically pollute and injure our health, right? Like, we're sacrificed for their gain. We don't get anything for it. You know, they build their wealth and their empires.
That's just one of the criticisms. Still with us, Bill McKibben, the co-founder of 350.org. His latest piece for The Nation magazine is headlined, Jerry Brown's Climate Legacy is Still Being Decided. Bill McKibben's 1989 book, The End of Nature, was the first book for a general audience about climate change. His forthcoming book, Falter, has the human game begun to play itself out. Bill, it's great to have you with us. It's right before a protest outside the climate summit. Now, many in the country and the world see Governor Brown as the green opposition to President Trump. But the tens of thousands of people that marched on Saturday, there was a massive amount of criticism of him, calling him a climate fraud.
So the answer lies somewhere in between. On the demand side of the climate equation, on the question of reducing the amount of energy we use and supplying it renewably, Brown has been good. There's no question that, along with a few other world leaders, California, under Governor Schwarzenegger, under Governor Brown, has taken really strong steps. And for obvious reason, it's the heart of where new technological innovation is coming from, and it's got lots and lots and lots of sunlight. The criticisms are coming in large measure from what he hasn't done, which is do anything at all about the other side of the energy equation, the supply side. California, as you know, is a big oil and gas state, though given the size of California's economy, it's a negligible part of the GDP. But it's not a negligible part of life for people who live literally next to oil wells, homes, schools, hospitals. A coalition of 800 community groups asked Brown to stop granting new permits and to take away those wells that are right next to where people, obviously people of color, low-income people, tend to live. So far, Brown's been unresponsive to that keep-it-in-the-ground demand. In fact, you'll recall last year when one protester raised the question of keeping it in the ground, he turned to him with the pithy response, let's put you in the ground.
Well, I want to go to that moment because Democracy Now! Had just flown into Bonn. We went to one of these mass protests outside, and many Native Americans were coming up to me, and they were describing this. Governor Brown was speaking, and he was disrupted by a group of Native Americans who were protesting fracking, and they were shouting, keep it in the ground, Brown defending. So I got to Governor Brown later that day, and I said to him, when they said keep in the ground, and he said keep you in the ground, if he would apologize to the Native Americans. This is what he said.
Come on, you know that in California, we have the strongest Native American policy of any state in the country. And we have the most environmental, and we have the toughest rules on oil. I don't think we should shut down oil in California and then take it from Venezuela or take it from places where the rules are even worse. We have to stop the cars. We have to get electric. We have to get public transportation. We need better land use. We've got to solve the problem. And I understand because we deal with protests all the time. But California, we are cutting our oil consumption, we're cutting our greenhouse gases. That's what we have to do, not just a slogan or a march around or talk. I'm talking about reality. And California has the strongest oil reduction rules in America. We're the leader. If someone wants to say, oh, get rid of oil, you mean get rid of our cars. If you got rid of cars, you'd have a revolution and there'd be shooting in the streets.
So that's Governor Brown, who's leading this climate action summit today, with people massively protesting outside this morning.
Yeah, I mean, one wants very much to be able to say to Jerry Brown, thank you and well done as he leaves office. But he's in a unique position to take leadership here precisely because he's leaving office. He never has to run again. He doesn't need the millions of dollars in contributions from the fossil fuel industry that he's taken in the past. He really could be the guy now, like Emmanuel Macron in France or Prime Minister Jardin in New Zealand, to simply say, we're not going to take more oil out of the ground. We don't need it. We're moving in a different direction. If he did that, his climate legacy on both fronts would be cemented.
So talk specifically about what you'd like to see coming out of this Global Climate Action Summit. And for people who don't even understand what's happened, I mean, it's been coming together for a few months. We know the UN climate summits all over the world every year that take place in November and December. This is something new.
Right. The theory here is that after Donald Trump withdrew America from the Paris Accords, one of the truly shameful pieces of diplomatic action that America's ever taken, that other people needed to show that they were still engaged on this issue of climate change.
Under the banner, we're still in.
Some of them using that banner. And so they are assembling now representatives of state and local governments to say, here are the steps we're going to take. And that's a very good thing to be doing. We do need to try and reassemble the momentum we had after Paris. But remember that the goal here is not to be Paris compliant. It's not. The goal here is to deal with the physics and chemistry of climate change. And one big part of doing that is stopping the supply of these fossil fuels, at least not expanding their operation. So all anybody asked was that he stop granting new permits and start taking out those wells that are right next to people's houses. So far, no real response on that. The other, of course, thing to realize and that people are working on hard here at the summit is around the question of money supply. Money is the oxygen on which the fire that is global warming burns. And we're working hard to try and staunch that supply. The good news, the best news I've heard all week is that the new totals for the fossil fuel divestment campaign reached $6 trillion in endowments and portfolios.
Wait, now explain this again when you talk about divestment.
We've asked for the last 5 years for institutions to sell their holdings in coal and oil and gas. This was modeled on the divestment campaign in the midst of South African apartheid. But it's now much larger than that campaign because, as of August, entire countries, Ireland in this case, were announcing that they were divesting from fossil fuel. New York City, London, their mayors put out a challenge on Monday to mayors of all the other big cities in the world. They said, we're divesting from fossil fuel. Time for everyone to take this step.
What about here in San Francisco?
San Francisco has not done it yet, surprisingly. California, as I say, remains in the grip often of coal and oil and gas interests. But one assumes that San Francisco will eventually take this step. The problem is the eventually. We don't have a hell of a lot of time left to deal with the crisis that we're in. You were showing those pictures from Greenland a minute ago. I was up there helping them film, and I got to say, it is sobering even for someone who's worked as long on this as I have to stand there and almost literally in real time watch those glaciers disappear into the sea. It's a reminder that doing anything less than all we can do is not okay at this point. And so that means we need Governor Brown to step up. And if he won't do it, we need Governor Newsom after him to step up, and the same all over the world. I will say that another piece of good news came late last week when the senator from Oregon, Mr. Merkley, introduced a bill in the Senate that would divest the federal government's pension funds from fossil fuel. It obviously is not going to pass right away, but it's a marker now laid down in this fight.
Do you feel encouraged by the movements that have drawn strength from what President Trump has done, this climate change denying president, among other things?
Well, look, I mean, one of the problems with Trump is that he's done so many bad things that we have to work on so many things at once. I mean, standing up for immigrants maybe most crucially. But climate change is the thing that we'll never, ever get another crack at, you know. The years that we waste here are years that are tipping us into a kind of permanent climate chaos. And we should stop acting surprised when bad things happen as a result. I mean, it's horrifying to think of people having to somehow flee this hurricane, Florence, which looks like it may kind of stagger along the coast for 2-3 days, pouring record amounts of water, probably amounts of water nothing like we've ever seen before. Someplace around the world now, we use that phrase every day, like something we've never seen before.
As we wrap up, your new book will be called Falter: Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out? 30 years ago, you write the climate change defining book, The End of Nature, where you talked about the two paths, the defiant reflex and the more humble way of living. Talk about what gives you hope now and what this book is about.
Well, the book is dark, it must be said, because there's an awful lot we haven't done and because our politics are so messed up. I mean, the fruit of a libertarian, every man for himself world, one of them turns out to be that the temperature goes up a few degrees. What gives me hope is the movement that's arisen. You know, there were tens of thousands on the street here in San Francisco on Saturday, but there were also people in huge demonstrations at 900 or 1,000 other places around the world. Some of them massive 50,000 people in Paris, and some of them incredibly beautiful and in places that your audience might not expect. 35,000 people turned out in Kampala, Uganda, where they're feeling the effects so powerfully.
Will you be outside at the protest today?
Yes, that's where I'm headed from the studio here.
And then inside as well?
No, they haven't given me a badge to go inside. I think I may have criticized the governor just a little too harshly.
Well, Bill McKibben, I want to thank you for being with us, co-founder of 350.org. We'll link to his piece in The Nation. Jerry Brown's climate legacy is still being decided. And that does it for today's show. I'll be speaking in Boulder, Colorado on Saturday night. That is September 15th. Check it out at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is job opening for broadcast engineer. Democracy Now! Is produced by an amazing group of people. Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.